You heard correctly. In Britain and in the United States, there once existed a truly grim profession known as a resurrectionist. People who seemed to bring the dead back not with miracles, but with shovels. They dug up fresh graves, pulled out newly buried bodies, sold them to doctors, collected their money, and for a long time almost no one tried to stop them. But that was only the beginning, because very soon bodies became scarce, and then the same men who dug up graves began creating new bodies themselves, and they were ready to commit any crime to do it. Night after night, cemeteries turned into battlegrounds. Rival groups fought for fresh graves, fired pistols at each other, and hunted for corpses as if they were valuable prey. Terrified families placed steel cages and heavy stone covers over the graves of their loved ones and hired watchmen to guard them. Meanwhile, medical schools paid without asking questions, taking whatever the resurrectionists delivered as if human bodies were nothing more than a commodity. And while this dark trade spread through the cities, another strange and disturbing entertainment flourished. Anatomical theaters became wildly popular, places where crowds gathered to watch surgeons dissect human bodies in a spectacle that mixed science, curiosity, and horror. And among all the suppliers of these theaters and medical schools, two men became especially feared: Burke and Hare. They discovered that a fresh corpse brought far more profit, and so they began murdering those whom no one would miss: poor wanderers, lonely travelers, people living on the edges of society. Their method was silent and left no marks. They suffocated their victims in a way that produced no visible injuries. Doctors bought the bodies and even praised the excellent condition of the material. The world believed that medicine served the light, yet these shadows clung to its history forever. Now you are about to hear 10 of the most terrifying and completely real facts about this dark age. Facts that will change the way you look at anatomy and the price paid for knowledge of the human body. Prepare yourself, because ahead lies a story in which death became a business and a human being became a product. The profession of the resurrectionist was not a myth or a whispered rumor. It was a very real occupation that flourished in Britain and in the United States during the early 19th century. And it existed because society balanced precariously between scientific progress and absolute moral collapse. People who called themselves resurrectionists earned their living by violating graves, stealing newly buried bodies, and delivering them to surgeons who desperately needed fresh cadavers for anatomical study. The demand for bodies grew each year because medical schools multiplied. Students wanted hands-on practice, and the law allowed the dissection of only the bodies of executed criminals, a number far too small to meet the needs of expanding science. This scarcity created a lucrative and grotesque market where human corpses became valuable merchandise. Resurrectionists worked in organized groups. They studied funeral schedules, bribed gravediggers, and memorized the layout of cemeteries with the precision of thieves planning a bank robbery. Every night they wandered through darkness, listening for the silence that followed a recent burial. Then they dug fast and ruthlessly, often removing a full body in less than 15 minutes. Sometimes they stripped the corpse on site to make the evidence harder to trace, and then they hauled the body to a waiting cart hidden behind cemetery walls. Surgeons rarely asked questions, because the fresher the body, the clearer the anatomical structures they wanted to demonstrate in their crowded lecture rooms. Anatomical theaters added another disturbing layer to this trade. These theaters attracted audiences who paid to watch dissections as if attending a grisly form of entertainment. Some people came out of curiosity, others came out of thrill-seeking fascination, and the resurrectionists knew that the more popular these demonstrations became, the more valuable their nightly harvest grew. This combination of demand, profit, and secrecy created an environment where moral boundaries crumbled. Fear spread across cities, and ordinary families realized that even in death, their loved ones were not safe. The terrifying shortage of bodies for medical study became one of the most disturbing forces driving the entire trade. Because during the early 19th century, the world of science expanded rapidly. While society struggled to understand the consequences, academic institutions multiplied each year. Universities opened new medical programs, surgeons demanded better training, and students needed real human cadavers to learn anatomy properly. Yet the law permitted the dissection of only the bodies of executed criminals, and the number of executions steadily declined as courts issued fewer death sentences, which meant that even in the largest cities, only a few bodies a year became legally available. This created a massive and desperate gap between scientific need and lawful supply, a gap that transformed human remains into rare and coveted objects. Medical professors felt growing pressure to demonstrate complex anatomical structures clearly and repeatedly. They needed fresh tissue, not dried skeletons, not wax models, and certainly not animals which differed too much from the human body. Soon students themselves complained that without real dissection, they would graduate unable to perform surgeries safely. And this fear spread through medical schools like a silent fire, as each institution competed to attract the best teachers and the most ambitious students. The scarcity of cadavers began to take on the qualities of a crisis. Professors whispered among themselves about where to find more material. Some secretly encouraged their students to seek unofficial suppliers, while others made quiet arrangements with shady intermediaries who promised to deliver bodies. No questions asked. Entire classes were postponed due to lack of cadavers, examinations were rescheduled, and lectures became abstract and incomplete because the corpses arriving through legal channels were far too few and far too decomposed to be useful. This growing desperation pushed respectable institutions closer and closer to the illicit trade until the boundary between education and crime became dangerously thin. And in the shadows, the resurrectionists waited, knowing that the less the law provided, the more valuable their nightly work became. The nightly battles that erupted across cemeteries became one of the most shocking consequences of the rising corpse trade, because as the demand for bodies continued to grow and the supply remained dangerously low, resurrectionist gangs began to treat burial grounds as contested territory, and every freshly buried body as a valuable prize waiting to be stolen. Competition transformed graveyards into hidden war zones where silence did not mean peace, but rather the tense anticipation of conflict. These gangs prowled through darkness, listening for distant footsteps, watching for lanterns flickering between tombstones, and preparing to defend their claim at any cost. Some groups scouted during the day, pretending to be ordinary mourners while carefully noting the newest graves and calculating how long it would take before soil softened enough to dig quickly at night when the city slept. Rival crews arrived armed with shovels, clubs, and pistols ready to fight for possession of a single corpse, because one body could bring enough money to feed several men. For days, confrontation became inevitable. Resurrectionists clashed in the cold hours before dawn. Fists struck skulls, boots slammed into ribs, shots echoed across open fields, and the dead lay silent while the living battled over them. Sometimes bodies were stolen twice, first by one gang, then by another, who ambushed them on the road, snatching the corpse back and racing toward the nearest medical school. Before their enemies, regrouped families living near cemeteries heard these violent struggles, yet few dared to report them, because the night sound of fighting suggested that their own relatives might soon be targets. Some gangs set traps, digging shallow pits, covering them with branches, and hoping rival thieves would fall in. Others split into lookout teams, posting men in trees with lantern shutters ready to signal danger. The brutal competition grew so intense that even surgeons whispered about these nocturnal wars, aware that the bodies arriving on their tables might have passed through the hands of several desperate criminals. Before reaching the anatomy room, the graveyard had once been a place of mourning, but now it had become a battleground where greed, fear, and death met in the dark. The rise of the corpse-stealing trade forced ordinary families to protect their deceased loved ones in ways that revealed the depth of fear spreading through society. Because as resurrectionist gangs grew bolder, people realized that burial no longer guaranteed peace in death, and so a strange industry of grave protection emerged across Britain and the United States. Families began installing heavy metal cages over fresh graves known as mortsafes. But these cages were not decorative. They were thick, immovable constructions bolted deep into the ground and designed to imprison the corpse rather than any living intruder. Each bar and lock represented the terror that a loved one might be torn from the earth within hours of burial. Craftsmen earned steady income forging these prison-like devices, and entire workshops specialized in manufacturing nothing but grave shields for grieving families. Others turned to stone masons who carved enormous slabs to lay across the soil, making the grave so heavy that no group of thieves could lift it quickly enough to escape unnoticed. Some families hired night watchmen who patrolled the cemetery with lanterns, clubs, and occasionally firearms walking between the tombstones, until morning frost covered the grass churches, bought lookout towers that allowed guards to scan the darkness for suspicious movement, and some communities organized groups that took turns keeping watch after funerals, especially when the deceased was young, healthy, or recently dead, qualities that meant the body would fetch a higher price in the illicit market. Traps appeared as well, ingenious and brutal devices rigged beneath fresh earth, some connected to hidden guns loaded with small charges of shot ready to fire. If disturbed, others triggered loud bells that rang through the night, warning families that thieves were near and waking entire neighborhoods in fear. Even the wealthy embraced extreme methods, buying vaults with sealed iron doors and hiring guards to sleep beside the entrance for several nights until the corpse decayed enough to lose value for medical buyers. This era turned mourners into strategists, forcing them to defend their dead as if protecting treasure. Because in truth, within these dark years of the resurrectionist trade, that was exactly what a human body had become. Medical schools and anatomical institutions became silent accomplices in the corpse trade, because their hunger for fresh bodies pushed them into a shadowy partnership with resurrectionists, and this unspoken relationship revealed how far the scientific world was willing to go in its pursuit of knowledge. Professors who publicly praised morality and progress quietly relied on thieves and criminals to supply the cadavers needed for lectures, dissections, and demonstrations. Some of these professors pretended ignorance, claiming they did not know where the bodies came from. Yet their refusal to ask questions was deliberate, because the fresher the body, the clearer the lessons, and the more impressed the students. Meanwhile, the administrators of these institutions allocated generous funds for the purchase of anatomical material, and these funds passed discreetly to intermediaries who promised to deliver corpses swiftly and without attracting attention. At night, resurrectionists arrived at back doors carrying sacks or carts with human remains, and porters admitted them silently, taking payment and recording nothing in their official books. In some cases, the transaction became so routine that thieves developed regular delivery schedules appearing after midnight, knowing that the professors would be waiting with lanterns burning inside the preparation rooms. Sometimes surgeons even offered bonuses for bodies without visible marks, encouraging suppliers to find victims who had died recently, and under mysterious circumstances, the competition between medical schools intensified this darkness because each institution wanted the best reputation for training surgeons, and high-quality cadavers became a symbol of prestige, leading some professors to cultivate direct relationships with gangs, hinting that they would pay more than rival schools if the bodies were fresh, intact, and delivered quickly. The academic environment began to warp around this unclean secret. Lectures filled with eager students drew large crowds, especially before important examinations, and professors insisted that they needed more cadavers to demonstrate techniques accurately. The entire system slowly adjusted to the rhythm of the criminal market until the line between legal study and illegal acquisition blurred completely, turning respected halls of science into quiet customers of the nighttime corpse trade. The moment when Burke and Hare entered the corpse trade marked a horrifying escalation, because until their arrival, resurrectionists had limited themselves to stealing bodies from graves. Yet these two men realized that the fastest way to obtain a fresh cadaver was simply to create one themselves, and through this discovery, they transformed an already dark profession into something far more monstrous. Burke and Hare lived in Edinburgh, a city filled with medical students, professors, and bustling anatomical theaters, all of which demanded an endless supply of corpses. The two men had no stable income and were constantly searching for ways to earn money. When one of Hare's lodgers died, owing rent, they decided to sell the body to a local anatomist and received more money than they had ever expected. This single event changed their lives because they suddenly understood that a human corpse, especially a recent one, had become more profitable than almost any honest labor they could ever find. From that point forward, they stopped waiting for death to come naturally and instead began identifying vulnerable people who could disappear without attracting attention. Lonely travelers, elderly drunks, impoverished women, and men with no relatives to claim them. Each victim was chosen carefully because a corpse with no known connections meant no investigation and quick payment. Their method of murder was disturbingly simple and left almost no marks. Burke would restrain the victim, pinning the body down while Hare pressed a heavy hand over the mouth and nose, cutting off breath and producing quiet suffocation. This technique became so effective and so difficult for doctors to detect that it later earned the grim name Burking after their crimes. As the killings continued, the pair developed a chilling routine. They drank with their victims to lower suspicion, then lured them into a quiet room, blocked the exit, and killed them with the same silent method. Within hours, the body would be carried through the streets wrapped in cloth and delivered to the door of an anatomy school where professors praised the excellent condition of the material, unaware or unwilling to admit that they were accepting the product of deliberate murder. Burke and Hare quickly grew confident in their new business, believing that as long as the bodies remained unclaimed and undamaged, they would never be caught. And for a time, this belief proved disastrously true, fueling a chain of killings that shocked the entire nation once the truth finally emerged. The method of killing perfected by Burke and Hare became one of the most horrifying aspects of their crimes, because unlike ordinary murderers who left bruises, cuts, or fractured bones, they developed a technique so silent and so clean that even skilled anatomists examining the corpses failed to recognize it as homicide. Their approach relied on absolute control of the victim's airway without producing the telltale marks normally associated with strangulation, poisoning, or blunt force. Each killing followed a deliberate pattern. Burke would throw his weight onto the struggling victim, pinning the torso and limbs to the floor, preventing any attempt to rise or kick for help, while Hare used both hands to clamp the mouth and nose, tightly shutting off every last breath the victim could take. This produced rapid suffocation, yet left the neck free of rope burns, the chest free of bruising, and the skin free of cuts, leaving only faint traces that looked natural or completely unremarkable to a 19th century doctor, because medical examiners of the time lacked modern tools for identifying subtle signs of asphyxia. The bodies appeared fresh, undamaged, and perfect for dissection, and this illusion of natural death made the method extraordinarily useful to the killers who understood that any suspicious wound could lead to discovery. They repeated this technique over and over, refining it with each victim, reducing noise, reducing struggle, reducing the chance that neighbors might hear anything unusual. In the lodging house where the murders took place, sometimes Burke sat on the victim's chest, while Hare knelt behind to hold the head in place, creating a deadly combination of pressure and breathlessness that ended life within minutes. Their confidence grew so strong that they performed killings even when other tenants were nearby, believing that the method was so quiet no one would suspect a thing. Medical students receiving the corpses later praised how intact the bodies were, unaware that the perfect condition they admired was the direct result of carefully practiced murder. Eventually, the method became so notorious that after the trial, newspapers across Britain reported it in gruesome detail, and the word burking entered the language as a term describing silent suffocation without visible injury, a chilling legacy that revealed how the hunger for anatomical material had made invisible murder not only possible, but deceptively easy. The victims chosen by Burke and Hare reveal the darkest truth of their crimes because they deliberately targeted the most vulnerable people in Edinburgh, individuals whose disappearance would slip through the cracks of society and whose deaths would raise no urgent questions. They sought out those who lived on the margins, people without family, without friends, without steady work or stable housing, people whose names were barely known to anyone in the city, and whose absence would not be reported for Burke and Hare. This invisibility meant opportunity. Every victim was selected. With cold calculation, the killers often roamed taverns, alleys, and lodging houses, searching for solitary travelers, exhausted laborers, elderly beggars, and women forced into poverty by illness or misfortune. Many victims came from the poorest districts where survival was already a daily struggle, and where strangers passed through unnoticed. These individuals often accepted invitations for shelter, food, or drink, because any kindness felt like relief in a harsh world. Yet behind this false hospitality lay a trap carefully prepared to ensure that the victim would never leave the room alive. Burke and Hare also preyed upon those who were intoxicated or ill, because sickness and drunkenness weakened resistance and made suffocation quicker and quieter. They sometimes targeted people recently arrived from the countryside because newcomers had no local ties and no one to check on their safety. Some victims were disabled or mentally impaired individuals who were particularly vulnerable and easily manipulated. The killers showed no remorse, exploiting desperation, hunger, and loneliness with unsettling ease. After each murder, they discussed how unlikely it was that anyone would come asking questions, and this confidence emboldened them to continue choosing victims that society already overlooked when the bodies were delivered to anatomists. The lack of inquiries reinforced the killers' belief that their victims existed on the edge of invisibility, their deaths unnoticed and unrecorded. The tragedy of these choices exposed a painful truth about the era: that poverty, social isolation, and lack of identity made people terrifyingly easy to erase, and Burke and Hare used this invisibility as a weapon, turning human vulnerability into profit and leaving behind a legacy of cruelty that shocked the country once their crimes finally came to light. The role of the anatomist who purchased the bodies became one of the most disturbing elements of the entire case, because the relationship between Burke and Hare and the respected scientist Dr. Knox exposed how deeply the medical world depended on the illicit trade and how willingly it ignored every sign of wrongdoing. Dr. Knox was a celebrated lecturer in Edinburgh, renowned for his dramatic teaching style, and for the large crowds that filled his anatomical theater. During dissections, he craved fresh cadavers because they allowed him to demonstrate organs, muscles, and tissues with clarity that older bodies could never provide. When Burke and Hare arrived at his door with their first corpse, he paid them generously and without hesitation, encouraging them to return. Whenever they had more material, his need for specimens was so great that he accepted bodies at all hours, even late at night, when only criminals moved through the streets. He never asked serious questions about the origins of the corpses, claiming that he was merely focused on education. Yet the unusual freshness of the bodies and the absence of paperwork should have raised immediate suspicion. Over time, the bodies delivered by the killers became so pristine that students whispered among themselves that these deaths looked too recent and too perfect to come from graveyards. Some cadavers still had the warmth of life in their limbs and lacked the soil or decay typical of exhumed remains. Yet Dr. Knox ignored these inconsistencies entirely. He praised the condition of the corpses, used them in crowded demonstrations, and rewarded Burke and Hare with higher payments, reinforcing their belief that their secret murders would remain invisible. Witnesses later reported that Knox seemed eager to receive the bodies quickly and to avoid any formalities, storing them immediately in the dissection rooms before assistants could examine them closely. He dismissed concerns expressed by some students and colleagues, insisting that his duty was to teach, not to investigate the source of his anatomical material. Although no court proved that he knowingly supported murder, public opinion turned against him once the crimes were revealed, and many believed that he had chosen ignorance because it was profitable and convenient. This silent complicity became a symbol of the moral blindness that allowed Burke and Hare to continue their killings for so long, showing how academic ambition and the pursuit of scientific prestige could overshadow humanity ethics and basic respect for life. The revelation of the Burke and Hare murders unleashed a wave of shock across Britain, because once the scale of their crimes became known, the public realized that the corpse trade was far more monstrous than anyone had imagined, and that the boundaries between science and crime had collapsed in the shadows. The trial exposed not only the killings themselves, but also the enormous demand for bodies that had fueled this dark market for years. People learned that medical schools had relied almost entirely on illegally obtained cadavers, and that the scarcity of lawful specimens had created a system where grave robbing and even murder could flourish. Unchecked newspapers published gruesome details describing how quietly the killers operated, how smoothly the corpses were delivered, and how eagerly anatomists accepted them without asking questions. The country erupted in anger. Families who once feared grave robbers now feared that their living relatives might become targets. because society had failed to protect the vulnerable and to control the ravenous hunger for anatomical material protests. Formed outside anatomy schools, crowds shouted accusations at professors, and some buildings required guards to prevent violence. The scandal forced Parliament to confront a crisis that had been ignored for too long. Lawmakers debated urgently, realizing that as long as only the bodies of executed criminals were legally available, the illegal trade would continue to thrive. Eventually, the government introduced the Anatomy Act of 1832, a law designed to end the black market by allowing medical schools to use unclaimed bodies from hospitals, workhouses, and poorhouses under strict regulation. This act dramatically increased the number of lawful cadavers, diminishing the profit of resurrectionists and removing the incentive for murder. Although the law did not erase public distrust overnight, it signaled a turning point, acknowledging the suffering of the victims and the moral decay that had enabled the horrors. The case of Burke and Hare became a lasting warning, reminding future generations that scientific progress without ethical boundaries could lead to catastrophic abuses, and that the pursuit of knowledge must never override the value of human life. Their crimes remained etched in history as a grim chapter that transformed legislation, public awareness, and the foundations of medical education forever. And now, if you want more rare, shocking, truthful, and absolutely unique stories that you will not find anywhere else, make sure to subscribe to our channel, because ahead lies much more that will astonish and captivate you.